It is not an official canonical document. It contains no legal arguments, no citations of canon law, no formal accusations against anyone. And yet, a simple letter, written in Switzerland a few days ago and addressed to the faithful of an entire community, has left everyone who reads it genuinely unsettled, because almost everyone expected something else entirely. After the condemnation issued from Rome, after sanctions of a severity that few Catholics alive today can remember being applied with such speed and such breadth, the logical expectation was confrontation, a hardened tone, a siege mentality, a community preparing to dig in and fight back with everything at its disposal. That is not what arrived. Instead, in that text, one word keeps returning again and again, and it is not the word war. It is the word humiliation. By the end of this video, you will understand why that single word changes the meaning of the entire story, and why the sentence that follows it has left even people who fundamentally disagree with the Society of St. Pius X genuinely without a ready response. For anyone who has lost track of the sequence of events, a brief recap is necessary. On July 1st, the Society of St. Pius X consecrated 4 new bishops at Écône without the pontifical mandate. On July 2nd, Rome responded with a decree that many across the Catholic world, including voices with no sympathy whatsoever for the Society's positions, have described as harsh, without real precedent in recent memory. A declaration of schismatic action, automatic excommunication for the 6 bishops directly involved, and sanctions whose language extended through an accompanying explanatory note toward priests and toward lay faithful who might be judged to have formally adhered to the Society's positions. Since that decree, the Catholic world has split along familiar lines. Some have applauded what they see as Rome's necessary firmness in defense of unity and papal authority. Others have described the response as a profound injustice, disproportionate to the offense and inconsistent with how comparable or more serious ruptures have been handled elsewhere in the Church in recent years. And caught in the middle of that argument, not participating in it by choice, but simply living inside its consequences, are the hundreds of thousands of ordinary faithful who attend society chapels and who have spent the weeks since July 2nd genuinely confused and genuinely wounded, uncertain what their own standing before the Church actually is. It was into this climate that, on July 19th, from the General House of the Society in Menzingen, Switzerland, the Superior General took up his pen and wrote to the faithful under his spiritual care. This was not the first time he had written in these weeks. Earlier, before the consecrations, he had written to Leo XIV himself in filial and deferential language, asking to be received, asking for the papal blessing, addressing the Pope as a son addresses a father. This second letter, however, arrives after the Pope's actual response had become clear, after the decree had been issued and the sanctions applied, and it carries an entirely different character. It is no longer a request directed upward toward Rome. It is a consolation directed toward the community itself, toward people who needed something from their spiritual father in a moment of genuine institutional crisis. The opening of the letter is what strikes anyone reading it first, because it is not a proclamation of defiance, it is an admission of disappointed hope. Until the very last day, the Superior General writes, I hoped for a gesture of benevolence, or at the very least, simple understanding, from the Holy See. Pause on that sentence, because it says a great deal more than its brief length might suggest. This is not the language of a man who set out from the beginning to provoke a rupture, and is now satisfied to have achieved one. This is the language of someone who waited, genuinely, and until the final possible moment, for some sign that a door might still open before the consecrations became irreversible. That door, from his account, and from the account of everyone inside the society's leadership, did not open. What arrived in its place was condemnation, delivered with a severity that he himself describes, without exaggeration, according to many outside observers who have compared it to prior disciplinary actions in the Church's recent history, as unprecedented. Then comes the passage that has given this entire story its emotional and rhetorical center, the sentence that has been quoted and re-quoted across Catholic media in every language reached by this controversy. This completely unjust condemnation represents an immense humiliation for people whose only desire is to defend the true faith and to work for the salvation of souls. Two distinct claims are compressed into that single sentence, and both deserve to be examined honestly rather than accepted or dismissed reflexively. The first is the claim that the condemnation is completely unjust. This needs to be stated clearly as what it is. It is the society's own position, offered from inside their own understanding of the necessity that drove their actions. It is not a final and settled verdict that this video is endorsing, and it exists alongside a formal canonical recourse now working its way through Rome's own juridical process, precisely because the question of justice here has not been definitively closed by either side. The second claim is the more interesting one, and it lies in the specific word chosen to describe what the community actually feels. Not persecution, not attack, not injustice in the abstract legal sense alone, humiliation. And humiliation, inside the vocabulary the Catholic tradition has always used to describe suffering borne for the sake of Christ, is not simply any word chosen at random from a thesaurus of grievance. It is the vocabulary of the Passion itself. It is what happens, specifically, to someone who is exposed publicly, stripped of the ability to defend themselves adequately in the moment, and left to bear what has been placed on them without the recourse of an immediate and satisfying vindication. The Superior General then turns to address the ordinary faithful directly, and here his tone shifts again, becoming something closer to paternal tenderness than institutional defense. The sanctions, he writes, are destined to affect you as well, in a manner that is frankly cruel. And this is the detail that deserves far more attention than most of the coverage surrounding the July 2nd decree has actually given it. The decree did not confine its effects to 6 distant bishops, whom most ordinary society faithful had never personally met. It reached, through its accompanying explanatory note, into the conscience of every priest and every lay family connected to the society, leaving many of them genuinely uncertain whether attending their regular Sunday Mass now constituted a sin. For the sake of clarity and precision, it needs to be restated here what has been established repeatedly in the weeks since the decree. Those who attend society masses are not, by that attendance alone, excommunicated. The decree and its accompanying note provided for a case-by-case evaluation applicable only to those who formally and consciously adhere to the Society's canonical position against obedience to the Pope, a standard that ordinary Mass attendance does not by itself meet. But the mere existence of that case-by-case language, without the accompanying pastoral clarity that would have prevented misapplication, was enough on its own to sow genuine anxiety across families who had done nothing more than continue attending the chapel where they had worshipped for years. And then arrives the sentence that transforms the entire letter from a document of grievance into something considerably more significant. I want you to understand, the Superior General writes, that this profound humiliation, which falls first and most heavily on the members of the society itself, carries a meaning before God that must not escape you. Read that slowly, because it does not do what the reader has been braced to expect it to do. Humiliation is not presented here as an injustice demanding vindication or retaliation. It is presented as something that carries genuine meaning before God. not a wound to be displayed publicly as evidence of victimhood, an offering. And from that reframing, the Superior General draws the conclusion that follows logically from it. If the price required to continue guaranteeing the true faith and the true sacraments to the faithful who depend on the society is this specific humiliation, publicly administered by the very institution the society insists it has never left, then that price, however painful, must be paid. This is a complete reversal of the script that almost everyone, on every side of this controversy, had been expecting. Everyone expected a legal counterattack pursued with maximum aggression, a permanent standoff, perhaps a siege mentality communicated in language calibrated to rally a wounded community around grievance and resistance. That is, after all, the pattern institutional conflicts of this kind almost always follow. One side issues a severe penalty. The other side, feeling wronged, mobilizes its base, sharpens its rhetoric, points to every historical grievance it can muster, and prepares for a prolonged battle fought in the press, in canonical filings, and in the loyalty of its own faithful. That is the script almost everyone following this story, on every side of the debate, had already written in their heads before the letter from Menzingen was ever published. Instead, the response that actually arrived is spiritual in its entire architecture, and it follows the ancient logic of the cross rather than the logic of institutional warfare. When you cannot adequately defend yourself before the tribunal that has already rendered its judgment, at least not immediately and not in the eyes of the wider public that has already absorbed the headlines, you offer what has been taken from you rather than merely fighting to reclaim it by force of argument alone. When you are humbled publicly, you accept the humiliation and hand it over to God, rather than converting it immediately into fuel for the next confrontation. This is the same path traveled by an entire lineage of figures the Church now honors as saints, men and women who were humiliated in their own lifetimes, often by the very institution that later recognized their sanctity with full solemnity and universal veneration. The Church's history is genuinely full of such examples, and they are worth naming at some length because they complicate any simple reading of institutional condemnation as automatically representing the final and complete word on a person's or a community's actual standing before God. Padre Pio was removed from public ministry for years. He was forbidden to hear confessions, forbidden even to celebrate Mass publicly at certain points, and watched with active and sustained suspicion by his own religious superiors and by officials in Rome who believed reports circulating about him that suggested fraud, hysteria, or worse. Some of the men who investigated him were convinced, sincerely and not maliciously, that they were protecting the Church from a dangerous deception. He endured this treatment for the better part of 2 decades without ever leaving his order, without ever publicly attacking the men who doubted him, and without ever ceasing to describe himself as a faithful son of the very Church that had humiliated him so thoroughly and for so long. The curé of Ars, St. John Vianney, was mocked and undermined by fellow priests in his own region who considered him poorly educated, unsophisticated in his theology, and entirely unsuited for the serious pastoral responsibility he had been given. He was investigated by his own diocese more than once. He attempted, on several occasions, to abandon his parish entirely and retreat into a monastery, believing himself unworthy and unwanted, before eventually being persuaded to remain. The confessional in which he would eventually hear the confessions of tens of thousands of pilgrims traveling from across France was, for years before that recognition arrived, a symbol to his critics of exactly the kind of unsophisticated rural piety they believed the modern Church needed to move beyond. Even young visionaries whose reported experiences the Church eventually approved, figures like Bernadette Soubirous at Lourdes, were treated in the years immediately following their claimed encounters with open and sustained institutional skepticism. They were interrogated repeatedly, sometimes harshly, by clergy convinced they were dealing with fraud, delusion, or the product of an overactive adolescent imagination. In some cases, they were actively discouraged by their own bishops from continuing to speak publicly about what they insisted they had experienced. Institutional humiliation, administered in good faith by churchmen genuinely trying to protect the faithful from error, preceded eventual recognition in every one of these cases rather than excluding the possibility of it. The lesson these examples offer is not that every condemned person is secretly a future saint. It is considerably more modest and more useful than that. It is that institutional condemnation, even when issued by legitimate authority acting in good faith, is not always history's final verdict, and the Church herself has repeatedly discovered this to be true only after the fact, often after the person condemned had already died, bearing the humiliation without ever seeing it lifted in their own lifetime. It is worth noting explicitly that in the days following the Menzingen letters' publication, many observers who hold no sympathy whatsoever for the Society's canonical position and who consider the July 1st consecrations to have been a genuinely grave and unjustifiable act, regardless of the necessity the Society invokes, have nonetheless acknowledged something notable about the tone of this specific response. Whatever else it does not read as the text of a resentful, embittered, schismatic community plotting its next move against an institution it has already mentally abandoned and now regards purely as an adversary. It reads as something else entirely, something closer to a wounded son writing to his own household from within a family he still considers, whatever the current estrangement, genuinely his own. But honesty requires giving the other side of this story its full and serious weight as well, because it would not be fair, and it would not serve the Catholic faithful generally trying to understand this complicated situation to present only one perspective, as though the matter were simple, or the fault entirely one-sided. Rome has reasons for the severity of its response, and those reasons are not trivial, not merely bureaucratic, and not reducible to institutional vindictiveness or a preference for one theological camp over another. Consecrating bishops without the pontifical mandate is a genuinely grave act within the entire logical structure of Catholic ecclesiology. It strikes directly at the heart of the visible unity the Church has always understood herself to require as one of her essential and defining marks, and at the specific and singular authority that belongs to the successor of Peter regarding who may legitimately be raised to the episcopate and sent to shepherd the faithful in Christ's name. No individual and no community, however sincere its motivations and however serious the pastoral necessity it genuinely believes it is addressing, can simply decide unilaterally to consecrate bishops for what it judges, from within its own perspective, to be the good of the Church, while bypassing the very authority the Church herself has always recognized as uniquely competent to make that determination. If every community, convinced of the rightness of its own cause, claimed that same prerogative for itself, citing its own version of necessity, nothing coherent would remain of the visible, structured unity that has always distinguished the Catholic Church from a loose federation of independently governed congregations, each following its own conscience regarding episcopal succession. This is not a minor technicality that Rome is enforcing out of institutional stubbornness or bureaucratic reflex. It touches something the tradition has always treated as genuinely central to what the Catholic Church actually is, and any honest account of this controversy has to hold that truth alongside everything the Menzingen letter says about humiliation and injustice, rather than allowing sympathy for the letter's tone to erase the seriousness of what prompted Rome's response in the first place. So what actually remains, once both sides of this story have been given their honest and complete weight, from this particular letter written in Menzingen on July 19th? Above everything else, there remains a lesson that extends well beyond this specific controversy and applies to anyone, in any circumstance and in any institution, who finds themselves publicly humiliated by an authority they cannot simply overrule through argument or appeal to a higher court of public opinion. Humiliation, when it is genuinely accepted rather than merely endured through gritted teeth while privately nursing resentment, and when it is consciously and deliberately offered up, rather than simply absorbed in silence until it can later be weaponized, ceases to function purely as defeat. It becomes instead a form of spiritual strength that operates according to a logic the world outside the Church rarely recognizes as strength at all, a logic that looks, to purely secular eyes, indistinguishable from weakness or capitulation. The Gospel taught this specific inversion long before any press release or canonical decree ever existed to complicate matters with the modern apparatus of media coverage and public relations. The one who is humbled and who accepts that humbling in conscious union with Christ's own passion rather than in mere passive resignation is not, in the deepest Christian understanding of these things, the actual loser in the encounter, regardless of how the institutional record of the moment happens to read to observers watching from outside. A final word of caution belongs here as well, and it deserves to be stated plainly rather than left implicit. It is genuinely easy, from the comfortable position of an outside observer with no personal stake in the outcome, no bishop threatening their own standing, no chapel whose faithful depend on their continued ministry, to distribute blame confidently in one direction or another from behind a keyboard or a camera. It is considerably harder, immeasurably harder, to actually remain faithful, patient, and charitable while being publicly demeaned by the very institution one has spent one's entire priestly or religious life serving with genuine devotion. That difficulty deserves real acknowledgement, regardless of where any individual ultimately lands on the underlying canonical question of whether the July 1st consecrations were justified. And above all, a question remains open now for the entire Church, not merely for the Society of St. Pius X, and not merely for the specific officials in Rome who drafted and signed the July 2nd decree and its accompanying explanatory note. If people who sincerely believe, whatever the ultimate merits of that belief under strict canonical analysis, that their only genuine desire is to preserve the Catholic faith intact and to work for the salvation of souls entrusted to their care, come away from an encounter with legitimate ecclesiastical authority specifically describing themselves, in writing, to their own community as humiliated, then perhaps something in how this entire matter was handled, procedurally and pastorally, rather than merely at the level of doctrinal and canonical substance, genuinely deserves reconsideration by those who currently hold the authority to reconsider it. Because the history of the Catholic Church is not only a history of firm and necessary discipline, correctly and justly applied against genuine error, it is also, repeatedly and quite unmistakably, across 20 centuries of recorded experience, a history of wounds that healed only when someone in a position of authority eventually chose to lower their voice rather than raise it further still, and a history of condemnations that time, patience, and subsequent careful reflection have gone on to revise, soften considerably, or, in a number of well-documented historical cases, entirely and formally reverse. How this specific chapter of that long history ultimately concludes will become clear only in the months ahead, shaped substantially by whatever decision eventually emerges regarding the formal canonical recourse the Society has already filed against the July 2nd decree. That process is still actively running its course through the Church's own juridical machinery. The 30-day response window has not yet closed, and whatever follows it, should the matter proceed further toward the apostolic signatura, has not yet produced anything resembling a final conclusion. But this letter from Menzingen has already accomplished something significant on its own, entirely independent of whatever the eventual canonical outcome ultimately turns out to be. It has shifted the entire character of this confrontation, at least for a great many people who have taken the time to actually read it, rather than simply reacting to its headlines, away from the battlefield of press releases, canonical citations, and institutional posturing, and onto the older and considerably more demanding terrain of the cross. And on that particular terrain, as the entire history of Christian spirituality consistently and repeatedly attests across every century of the Church's existence, the party that shouts the loudest is very rarely, in the end, the party that ultimately prevails. What do you think? Leave a comment below. Amen. God bless you.